Okay, good morning, everyone. Let's begin with Gasho and recitation of the Nembutsu. Naman Navats, Naman Navats, Naman Navats, Naman Navats, Naman Navats, Naman Navats. Thank you. Well, welcome everyone for attending our Center for Buddhist Education, hosted by the subcommittee of the CBE, the Living the Dharma subcommittee. We warmly welcome all of you from various parts of the country, and even I think I saw a couple of people from Canada attending. Our speaker today, Reverend Dr. Kenji Akahoshi, while working professionally as a dentist for many years, was a Shin Buddhist his whole life. Prior to studying Buddhism at the Institute of Buddhist Studies, he was active at the San Jose Betsuin and served as board president even from 1995 to 1996. Besides studying at IBS and receiving a master's degree in Buddhist studies, he also has a master's degree from the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology in Palo Alto. He served as a minister at the San Diego Buddhist Temple for 8 years. Upon his retirement, he is a popular speaker in the BCA and Hawaii as well. He is still serving on the BCA's Membership and Propagation Committee, and at the recent National Council meeting, he held and put on a wonderful workshop on ideas on growing our sanghas. Maybe many of you listened to that and saw that talk. Today, he'll be speaking on the benefits of Shin Buddhism. Personally, I wholeheartedly agree with Reverend Akahoshi's approach and perspective on Shin Buddhism and how it must be given contemporary interpretation for it to resonate with people today. So we're very grateful to have Akahoshi Sensei be our speaker. I'll turn it over to him now.
Yeah, let's see. Hopefully I can get my technology straight here, but thank you very much, Bishop Harada. And welcome everyone. Today we hope to really clarify some confusion about Shin Buddhism. And we're interpreting Shin Buddhism from a contemporary standpoint. And that means we usually have a veil of Christianity, a difference of cultures, truth that was related in mythical form, and many misconceptions about Buddhism that kind of hinders our knowing Shin Buddhism as it is. And so I'm calling this a 21st century perspective of Shin Buddhism. And it's not through the lens of others. It's through how I, as a Shin Buddhist, see this. Truth is very profound and deep. And philosophers talk about it. But also, truth can be given in a very simple way, harmoniously to ordinary people like us. And these deep truths are conveyed to us in Shin Buddhism. And so I'm offering kind of a simplified guide that we can follow. We really don't have a structure in Western American Shin Buddhism. So I'm offering one that will help people see Shin as kind of a structure, and then we can place a lot of our traditional things that we hear into that. It's also kind of a specific path. And so, again, former Bishop Yamaoka has said that the West needs an educational process because Buddhism is so different than what Western religions are about. Now, in Japan, of course, the originator of Shin Buddhism, much of the culture, language, and values, I think, were shaped by Shin Buddhism. And so things are natural. Things that are talked about are seen and experienced every day. Whereas in America, it's a little different. And this is the problem we face. And you may recognize that our grandparents and parents often could not, relate what the doctrine was about. They may not even be able to talk about the Eightfold Path, Four Noble Truth, things like that. And yet they lived it. It was lived through an experience. And so that's what we'll be looking at. So let me start with a story that may help us see where we are. Now, one day, there's a young seeker, and he wants to know about Buddhism. So he goes to the place where he knows the master lives. But before going to the front door, he realizes that he's kind of toward the back garden, and he's by a side gate. And as he looks over the gate, he sees the master just sitting in the garden enjoying the sun. And so he bravely enters the side gate and approaches the master and says, "Sir, I've come here to learn about Buddhism. Would you be able to teach me?" Now, the master sees the sincerity of the student, and so he welcomes him in. He says, "Yes, come in. Please have a seat next to me." And so the young seeker does. He sits down. And the master says, "Before we talk about Buddhism, let's have some tea." And so, of course, the seeker says yes and accepts that. So the master puts down a teacup for the young seeker and proceeds to pour some tea into the cup. And as he pours, the cup fills up. And as it fills up, it begins to reach the top and then it overflows, going into the ground. And the seeker says, "Stop, stop." His eyes are wide open. "Sir, why do you continue to pour tea?" And the master gently puts the teapot down and says to the seeker, "Before you can learn about Buddhism, you must empty your own cup." And so I think we all come with cups that are not quite unfilled. And as Americans, we all come with a coffee mug that's stained with coffee. And so if we have this coffee mug and we pour pure, good Japanese green tea in it, it wouldn't taste quite right. And this is something we have to remember because we have the taste of this, the coffee, and we have stains of the Christian idea of religion, some mythical stories that are 800 years old, misconceptions about Buddhism. All these things are stains that kind of hinder our viewing Shin Buddhism in its clear light. So hopefully we can, begin to present something that makes sense to us in our contemporary life. And so we are going to present a structure and a process to help Shin Buddhism become more relevant. Now, now we posted the handout, and you might follow that. And we have first, Jodo Shinshu Buddhism, and I just want to clarify some words in the way I tend to interpret them. First, we have Jodo, Pure Land. I tend to regard Pure Land in a different wording, Pure Realm. And that to me kind of indicates that it's kind of a state of mind. It's not a geographical location. So Pure Realm. And then we have Jodo Shinshu. And Shin kind of differentiates it from Jodo, Honen's sect of Pure Land school. So we have the Jodo Shinshu. And then we have Buddhism. And to me, Buddhism is a process of awakening. And so to me, Jodo Shinshu Buddhism might be interpreted in these words of an awakening process of the mind to align with truth. Now, that sounds good, perhaps, but truth is a very big word. It can mean many things, and it's hard to define because they're just, what is this word truth? And so for today, I just want us to think of it in two levels. One is the practical. And the reason I bring this up is because we kind of get confused sometimes, but let's see. Okay, so we had this awakening process of the mind to align with truth. And then at a practical level, we have this that we see every day. We have the sun coming up, and I think we can all agree it rises in the east, sets in the west. And we set our watches to it. In fact, we make up things because tomorrow we go from standard time to daylight savings time. And then throughout the world, there are these artificial lines of time differences where on one side, Pacific time, it's a certain time. And, the line before it, eastward, it can be an hour earlier. But this is what runs our life, right? We just have a practical level of understanding truth. And it works. Everything, trains, airlines, everything works on this practical level. And so this is the level we work on. And yet there's a different level. And as we sit in our, wherever we are, and we watch, this is another level. Now, is this true? We're on a planet that's, circling around the sun, and the sun is part of this galaxy we call the Milky Way. And the Milky Way is actually a galaxy in this universe, and there are billions of galaxies. So this is another truth. And if this were not true, we wouldn't be able to zoom in. We need these satellites enabled to, come to where we are. So we do have these two levels of truth. Now I got to figure out how to get out of here. Let's see. Nope. I lost that thing where it says, okay, I'm not quite sure how to get back to.
Are you looking for the share screen on
Maybe the Zoom? Yeah, okay. Okay. Anyway, so these are the two levels, and I think we could admit that that second level is true reality. Every time we have a practical level, there is a deeper level that's often invisible. And yet that's true. Our scientists tell us it's true. The fact that we're using satellites to zoom in on this program is true. And so we need to keep these two things in mind. Now, what was Shinran and Renyo, Honen, what were they writing about? At that time, they were writing about life and death, because death was a real issue. Women and children died in childbirth. Death was very common. If you had an accident, you didn't have a hospital you could run to. There were infections, illness, and so forth. So death was a constant companion. And so what we hear in the doctrine are ways to, deal with life and death. Now, if your grandfather was a peasant, there'd be a good chance that your grandson would be a peasant. So there wasn't much upward mobility. And so in order for life to get better, it may have to be in the afterlife. And so we have these stories of, what happens after we die. And then we have these elaborate symbols of, this Pure Land, of this place that is paradise. And so you see, we were dealing at that time at a level of life and death, where things would improve after one's passing. Now, also at that time in the 13th century and up to just a couple of hundred years ago, the unknown was always depicted by deities or gods, thunder, lightning, earthquakes, all these things we didn't know about. And so they were, depicted by saying that some god did it. And so you see, we have Amida Buddha depicted in, rendered in kind of a theistic form, and we hear that a lot. And that sometimes bothers us because in Christianity, we have Jesus, God, and so forth, and there seems to be a similarity, but I'd like to clear that up a little later. So in Christianity, death is bad. In other words, life is good, death is bad. It's a dualistic system, and we'll talk about dualism. But in Buddhism, death is just part of life. It's the other side of it. Now, in Shinan's interpretation was a little different than Honen's, in that this Pure Land was not an afterlife event. It was a present life event, meaning we could wake up, while we were alive. And so that changed things. That meant that we could look at life in a whole different way. And so, what's most important to us if we see life from an awakened viewpoint? Well, I was inspired by Vasubandhu's 5 gates, and so I've written something about the 5 benefits, the areas of benefits of Shin Buddhism. And this is just a made-up process where we might be able to see that there is a process that we might go to. And in this process, this introduction, we could start to place some of the more involved doctrines. But we see that, there is a way to do this. And so I'm saying the first benefit is the fact that in Shin Buddhism, it's specifically for the common ordinary person. And we have a practice that we use anytime at any age. And that, as I said earlier, it's a way that, we just wake up and align our mind with truth. And the truth I'm talking about is that seeing where we see the universe. That's a different level than the practical level. Now, what we're saying here is that there is so much more that we have received than anything we might achieve on our own. And I think that's the point that Shinran is making to us. And so our practice as ordinary people is to realize that. And that this is the truth, that there's so much that's been done for us. And we take things for granted. We pass over that and we try to think of ways that we can be better just on our own. Now, Shinran realized this, and you know this, I'll try to go through this quickly. Of course, he was a monk at Mount Hiei, admitted that he could not achieve and practice the precepts. He had a great integrity, so he left the mountain, followed Honen. And we know that Honen and the Jodo group was disbanded due to the threats of the older schools of Buddhism. And so Shinran was exiled to Echigo and lived among the common people. And here he realized that as an ordinary person, you really couldn't control your ego. You needed the self, the ego to survive, to be responsible for your family. And so he realized that these ordinary people had the same problem he as a monk had, that we're not able to control our passions, all these things that the Buddha talked about. Because initially, if you were to become a disciple of the Buddha, you gave up ordinary life and you became a monk or a nun, and you didn't have any of these responsibilities. But again, Shinran realized that the Buddha had also had a path for ordinary people who had these responsibilities. And so, he wrote things down. But here again, I want to point out that we have some converts who do monastic practices, such as meditation and mindfulness, and they might do it an hour a day. And the thought is, well, I'll achieve some sort of awakening. And you can see that Shinran, as a full-time monk for 20 years, admitted he was not able to do this. So again, what we're doing is trying to align, awaken our minds to what is true reality. So this is what the writings are about. Here we go. Okay. Now, let's see. Now here we go. Okay, here we go. Okay, I'll go through this rather quickly. I've done this, and I'll refer you to a couple of talks I've done earlier. But Shinran writes this in Shoshinge. Still the clouds, mist of greed and desire, anger and hatred covers always the sky of true and real Shinjin. But though the light of the sun is veiled by clouds and mist, beneath the clouds and mist, there is brightness, not dark. That's quite a optimistic view. And he says, when one realizes Shinjin, an awakening to truth and attaining great joy, one immediately leaps crosswise, closing off the five great. Now, what happens if you were to put your hand up and block, seeing my face? Now, that's one view. If you were to leap crosswise, you could see my face. So nothing changes except a shift. And so I think what Shinran is saying here is that what we do in life is not improve ourselves or do these practices to achieve something. We just shift our perspective, shift our mind. And we do this when we recite Nembutsu, Namo Amida Butsu, realizing there's a deeper truth. And so it's just that it's almost that simple, that there's truth all around us, but we tend to look at ourselves and hope that we ourselves can individually do better, when in fact there's so much that's being done for us and that has been done for us. And so we're not trying to eliminate our evil parts. The clouds of mist remain in it. By shifting our view, we see this other reality, and it's very optimistic. So how do we do this in everyday life? Well, again, he says, one is naturally brought to the stage of the definitely settled, solely saying the Tathagata's name constantly. One should respond with gratitude to the universal vow of great compassion. So what he's saying is that we just need to respond with gratitude, and that saying the Buddha's name with the thought of gratitude is what it's about, what our practice is about. Now, if we're unsure of these words, Namo Amida Butsu, and for newcomers, that's kind of hard to pronounce, we realize that gratitude, just the thought of thank you, is a practice for ordinary people. It's an entry point. It's not the full thing, but at least it gives us a thought of what this Nembutsu is about. And in Japan, everything has this thought of arigatai. There's a whole sense of gratitude about life. And what it does is it brings the Buddhist teaching into ordinary life. And so what I think this we can say is that as a teaching for ordinary people, it's to appreciate what I have to balance the desire for what I don't have. And this is what I think is a way we can respond to people when they ask what Shin Buddhism is about. It's just to appreciate what I have. And it's to balance that desire for what I don't have. And as I said, you know, the words thank you is a response to receiving. And so I think this is the unique characteristic of Shin Buddhism, that it's about receiving, not achieving. And we get confused with some words such as meditation. We say we don't meditate, but we don't meditate to achieve any spiritual awareness. We meditate to be quiet for health reasons, for you know, many other things, but it's not to achieve anything. So just recall that Shin Buddhism, the practice is about receiving. And we often hear that hearing is a practice. And here we have, you know, receiving as a major point. Now again, now it is a shift from please, because constantly, you know, our commercial society has us wanting the next best thing. Shifting from please to thank you, to realize that we've received so much already. And these are the benefits that we have that are laying all around us. And what we need to do is recognize that. So this is the middle path. The middle path, just to see that, you know, we have received all these things. Now, let's see. Okay. Now, this isn't as exotic as some of the other practices, you know, just to say thank you. And yet, if this is a way to go about life, I think like everything else we do, we have to have a practice. And it starts out very concentrated, you know, intense. There's a intention to it. And so what I've been advocating, and many people have done this, and I find this to be very helpful, using the Eightfold Path almost backwards, so that we actually have a method of practice. And so looking at this, we have the meditation. So what we might do in the morning is just meditate for a minute and think about something that we could appreciate, something very calming. And let's say it's a light switch. And we have to keep that in mind. And that takes a little effort. So in our livelihood or throughout the day, when we come to a light switch, we turn it on. And then we say thank you. And that thank you puts a thought of gratitude in our mind. And then it shifts our perspective, because we realize that that light switch got there because of the efforts of so many other people, electric company, I guess Tesla or whoever invented Edison, you know, who thought of putting electricity into homes and so forth. But anyway, there's this whole process. And so during the day, every time we come to a light switch, we just say thank you. And we have this whole process of thought that something very common is here because of the efforts of others. And after doing that for a week, we begin to realize that it's very special. Now, here in California, we're having these storms and the power goes out and people are getting used to not having power for some time, often for hours or days. And this is when we begin to realize things may not be taken for granted. And so after doing this, perhaps with the light switch, we might move to something like a water faucet, that in the morning we think about the water faucet. And so during the day when we turn on a water faucet, we say thank you. And the same thing, our thoughts of how did that get there? It's clean water. In much of the world, there may be water, but it's not drinkable. And here we just turn on the tap, and for most of it, it's very clean and accessible. So we see that very common everyday things are available to us all the time, and we've taken it for granted. So this very simple act begins to expand. And so every day you might add something, the water faucet, the car, hopefully your car will start, but we have all these conveniences that we may have taken for granted. And so we begin to see all the benefits that we have taken for granted, and that it's not what I've achieved. I may have bought these things. I may have done some things so that I benefit from them. But for the most part, many other people and the efforts of so many others in just inventing these, creating a system where it's available to me in my home, especially now in the 21st century for most of us, these things are so common, we often just ignore it. But then again, as Shin Buddhists, our ordinary life, we begin to appreciate the ordinary things that were not available to even Shakyamuni Buddha. We live in a life greater than the princely life he led. You know, if we want the temperature to be hotter or cooler, we turn on the air conditioner or heater, and for most of us, things work. So again, this is you know, the advantage of having all these things. And so what we're saying is we see this all the time, and we say this in our services, the three treasures, which we repeat many times. Hard is it to be born into human life. Now we live it. Difficult is it to hear the teachings of the Blessed One. Now we hear. So we're admitting that these things are there, and we are living and hearing and learning about it right now. So these are benefits that we have. And this is what Shinran is telling us, that we have all these things that we benefit from that are here. And if we think of this eightfold path from meditation, mindfulness, gratitude, then it changes our perspective of things. And again, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Nembutsu, Namo Amida Butsu, we may just start off with thank you. And for those of you who are Shin Buddhists, we might just go to Naman Dao with a thought of gratitude. But this is a practice that we can do. Now, if we don't do the practice, it just kind of remains a concept. You know, it's like be kind, be courteous, be compassionate. Yeah, that's a good idea. But if we don't have a process of practice of doing that every day, of really appreciating the everyday things, these things kind of just stay out there. Oh yeah, gratitude, that's fine. But I really encourage people to do the practice. And then some of the other things I'll be talking about, you know, will begin to make sense. Now, let's see. One of the things I find most helpful is coming to a stoplight, because we all do that when we drive. And when you come to a yellow or red light, we're usually thinking, well, I'm going to lose some time. But stop and say thank you, because that stoplight is there to let the other cars in the other directions go. It relieves us from having an accident. And so we're thinking of we, all of us, you know, this whole interdependence. And so that stoplight may keep us, you know, for a minute or two longer, but then it allows the cars on the other side to go. So again, this is one way that during the day we think about, you know, how our lives are how we benefit from life, from things that we may feel that hinder us. This kind of ends this portion that I've done talks on, and so I refer you to talks I've done in 2022, the Eitaikyo talk at the BCA National Council meeting, and also I gave a talk at the Bloom Futaba lecture in Hawaii in October of 2022, and that gives you a lot more detail on, this the practice of what we just talked about. Now. So we'll move on to the second benefit. And the second benefit is belonging to a Shin temple or a community. And there's a great benefit in belonging to a temple, because what we're talking about here is practicing a way of life, looking at values that are different than what we might be used to in our usual American way of seeing things. And I want to say that belonging to a temple is a place that we might call a dojo. A dojo is a place of practice, and we're practicing the Dharma. And the reason we need to do that is because it's not based on mythology. It's based on science, we could say. But if you think about it, sometimes we hear that Buddhism, agrees with science. But I don't think that's true. I think it's the other way around. Science agrees with the Buddha Dharma. And the reason is science as we know it may be 500 or 600 years old. But the Buddhist truth is 2,600 years old. And we're just using the same principles to look at life. We observe something, we have a theorem or say what we think is true, and then we try that out. And then we say it's true until we know something at a deeper level. And so you see, again, science is replicating the Buddhist truth. So it's not that we need to be validated by science. The Buddhist truth really, holds truth. And so again, the reason for belonging to a temple is that we work out these things. And the basic thought of science could be designated by what the Buddha called the 3 marks of existence. And the first mark is impermanence, which means that nothing stays the same, everything changes. And we see that, when you're young, you're happy that you're getting older. If you're older, you're not so happy that we are getting older, but things change. And we see that just by observation. The second truth is interdependence. Now, the Buddha said this 2,600 years ago. And now science is saying, yeah, that's true. And we find that in the world of atoms and molecules, where we know that there's an interchange. And that, the global warming, all the things, geopolitics, everything is connected to everything else. And so, again, the Buddhist truth is shown in just the way we live our lives. And this is true of all things. Now, this is why we need a place where we can go to see if this is true and how we can live our lives with these truths. And the thing is, there's a third mark of existence, and we'll talk about this a little more in the next phase. But the third mark of existence, I like to put as the existence of the ego self. Now, sometimes the third mark is talked about the life of suffering. But the ego self, the sense of self, is different than all other animals. Now, the one thing is that we have this self that can really look at itself and analyze and really wake up to things. I don't know if other animals can do that. And yet we as humans have this ability. But this ability of having this ego self also has another ability. And that is it can look at impermanence and interdependence and either ignore or reject it. And instead favor me. That it takes, trying to sustain and enhance this ego self for my benefit. And the Buddha tells us about the second noble truth, the greed, ignorance, hatred. These are things that we may think enhance the self. And what that leads to is suffering. And so this ego self is something that is a problem. we can wake up and realize all these things that benefit us, but it also has this ability to reject, what is known throughout the universe, that everything's connected and everything changes. And so this is why a temple is a place where we're in an environment where we have like-minded followers, where we can test this out. And this temple, I say it's like if you had a child that was real good at tennis. Well, what if you had a tennis court? He could really improve. Or a swimmer. And if you had a swimming pool that he could go to every day and learn how to swim better, he could really improve. Well, as Shin Dharma followers, we have a temple where we can attend. And for those of you who are far from a temple, it may not be as good, but we have Zoom. You can attend discussions and classes, by computer. But it's nice to have a place where we actually have a dojo, a place to practice, because what we're practicing is somewhat different than what the general community may be doing. And we'll talk about that. Because we do have problems in the world. And so how do we resolve these problems? We hear hopes and prayers, or we think about, well, we'll get rid of this. Our society is based on what we call duality. In order to have one thing good, you have to have bad. And the thought is, well, we'll get rid of the bad. But that really goes against interdependence. That in Buddhist thought, we think more in terms of partial and wholeness, and that we need that negative part. It's not that we need it, it's just that it's there, and we have to include it. And that's what this interdependence is about. And yet our society is really set on having only one number one. When you have one number one, that's not balanced. And so much of what guides our life in the Western world is not suited for this universal way of thinking of interdependence and impermanence. And so it's really important to have a temple, a place to go to where we can practice and work out these things. The other thing about a temple that is sometimes difficult is that hanging out at the temple has this other effect, and we can call it osmosis. We can think about it like the chicken teriyaki that we often sell at our bazaars. And you marinate that in shoyu and sugar and the sauce for a couple of days, and that chicken really takes on that. And that is what I think happens at Shin temples. Just hanging around the Shin temple, by osmosis, you get some of these values of just appreciating things as they are. And so these are things that we might not understand with our minds, but then just through our hearts, we begin to accept the things, the values of Shin Buddhism. And what we're absorbing is wisdom and compassion. So let's move on to the third benefit. And I talked about this a little bit. The third benefit is really knowing the true nature of the self. And by saying the true nature of the self, I mean that, here's myself. I'm an entity. I know what I see myself, so I think I know what that means. And yet that may not be what the true nature of the self is about. What is the self? Now, the Buddha has said that the mind kind of creates our reality. And our reality is, determined. And yet we have some words that I think have become confused, again, with the coffee stains of, the Christian religion or mythology and other things. And one of the things that hinders us is this thought of the self, that we need to control the self, the ego, or, it's bad, things like that. Well, in Shinnan's day, when we thought of the self, it was the whole person. It's like when I was in elementary school, the atom was the smallest unit of mass. Of course, at that time, I'm not that old. They knew it at the time that it wasn't because they had the bomb. But anyway, the atom was supposed to be the smallest unit. And now we know that the atom has smaller parts. Quantum theory tells us about these quarks and Higgs particles and so forth. And so, the atom has smaller parts. Well, the person has smaller parts. And one thing we might do as Shin Buddhists is realize that it's not the whole person that's evil. Dr. Mark Blum thinks that the Japanese word akane has a different interpretation, that it doesn't have to mean evil, that it could mean ordinary. And that when we see the words evil, we might just substitute the word ordinary. And so the thought in Shinnan's time is that the whole person is evil, ignorant, and we can't get out of it. But in modern thought, it's just part of us. And the part of us, it's a little more refined. And there are methods we can use to kind of work with this thought. Now, knowing that there's a part of us that's just evil, kind of allows us to admit that we're not all bad. And the thing is, let's see. The whole thing is about balance. That it's not that we're all bad, it's just that there are things to realize that, again, the mist of greed and all that, there's also brightness. And so we need to think about balance. And that in modern psychology, there's something called the shadow. And the shadow is such that all of us have this dark part of us, and it's developed in childhood when we realize that we do things that our parents or our community says we shouldn't do. And so we kind of shift that back. And it's like knowing what the back of your neck looks like. We don't know. If you want to know what your shadow looks like, you can ask your spouse or a good friend. And when they tell you, you won't believe it. Because none of us can admit that our shadow has all these evil, greedy, hateful thoughts, but it's there. And so it's not all of us, but it's part of us that's, has these negative feelings. But then again, in modern psychology, we're aware of Freud's id, ego, id, and superego. We also have the parent, the child, and the adult. There are different ways of seeing our psyche, that there are parts of it. I like Roberto Assagioli's depiction of the psyche, and he has about 7 different parts. And to me, it really agrees with Shinnan's thought of the higher and lower unconscious. That again gets into some other things. But anyway, the thought that we're not completely evil. What we also have is, Yoda, Landon Yamaoka, talks about Star Wars. And in that you have all these characters, Darth Vader, Yoda, the youthful youth. We have all these different sub-personalities. And so we can see that we might admit that we have this shadow, but we also have the ability to wake up. And that's part of us too. And Shinran does admit that, after a while, we tend to refuse to take the poisons of greed, hatred, and ignorance. And so this is one way of kind of dealing with this thought of the evil person. And I put that out there so that we have a more current concept of what the self is. Now, there's another thing with this whole thing about the temple. This is where we might be working out our issues and applying Buddhist principles to it. But there's an irony, because often at these temples, we still use the methods that have got us into this problem. Now, we have to realize that the temple is an all-volunteer organization, and we really appreciate people who take, leadership roles, or just chairpersons who take over certain aspects. But then we have to realize that we need to use Buddhist principles, and that when we do this, we don't just take command and say, this is the way we need to do it, my way, that we need to open it up to other people's views also. And so although this temple is an area where we can try these practices, if we don't do the practices, it defeats what I've been saying about having a place to practice. One thing, and you might be familiar with this, this was a long time ago, I heard one member say that they quit helping at Obon because another member insulted them, said something, and so he quit coming to help at Obon. Well, you realize that that other member is also a volunteer, but then the second member took that as representing the whole temple, and so he decided not to help out. And so we really have to bring Buddhist principles into how we interact with each other, so that we can bring a harmonious atmosphere. And again, that's what interdependence is about, relationships. So I just want to bring that up to say that, yeah, it seems like we should be doing some things, and yet often we're in a place where we're propagating kind of old methods of dealing with each other. Now, a second way of dealing with, our ego, because again, we hear so much about diminishing the ego, controlling the ego. From a psychological point of view, that's impossible. So what I've often advocated was, expanding the ego. And by that, I mean that rather than just think of myself, think of someone like Martin Luther King or Gandhi. Gandhi did not have a small ego. His ego included all of India. And Martin Luther King thought that his personal ego was the same as all oppressed people. Now, we might think that expanding our ego is too grand. How can I have this little ego kind of represent everyone else? But looking at it, we do this naturally. Anyone who has a child, their ego expands immediately to their spouse and child, the family. And whatever happens to the child is much more important than what happens to the self. Now, we do this all the time. We expand it to a group. It could be the temple. I identify with the temple. It could be a city, a team. Think about Ukraine right now. There may be a shopkeeper who, identified himself with his shop. And with the invasion of Russia, he became a soldier. And as such, he now identifies himself with all of Ukraine. So we do this naturally, that we have an individual self, but instead of diminishing itself, we expand it to include others. And I would think that we could include the temple as part of our identity. And we could expand it to the world in terms of eco-sangha, knowing that what I do really affects all of the world, how we use our resources, and how I can influence others to be aware of that. So again, another way of dealing with this ego self is to expand. Now, a third way is to think of the self, and this gets a little tricky, but is this. At the top, you see this E equals mc squared. That's I think we know that that's true. Einstein's energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. Basically, if you look at that second and third line, mass and energy, and that includes everything in the universe, are two forms of the same thing. So as humans, we're part of this. And our body might be considered mass. And instead of energy, we can call it spirit. Sometimes spirit is a a word that has kind of a tricky connotation to it. But anyway, it is energy, and that affects all of us. Now, we might be able to see this a little better. There we go. Okay, when you burn a log, what happens? You burn a log, which is mass, and you get light and heat. That's the energy within the log. Now, how did that happen? That happened because as the little tree was growing, it took in energy from sun, water, earth, nutrients, and it grew. So it took in energy and built up more mass. And so we see this naturally. Mass and energy are part of two forms of the same thing. And this is true with the self. Now, it's a little harder to see in the self because, we're humans and we see the mass, we see our bodies, and we want to keep that in good shape. We want to make sure we don't fall down and break any bones, but we don't see the energy part very much. And yet the energy part is what we exchange with each other, words, ideas, love. It's there. It's just that it's not so visible. But we as humans, just like a tree, the burning of a tree, we take in energy. As infants, we have mother's milk, we have nutrients, people feed us, and we're educated. We just take in all this energy from others, and we grow, and our mass grows, and we become adults. And so as adults, we have all these things that support us. And we might recognize that we are part mass, body, and part energy. But most of our attention is placed on mass, our body. And we want to make sure we're comfortable, that we look good, we have the right clothes and so forth. And some of us may not pay as much attention to the spiritual part. And of course, now in this modern era, after I would say the second half of the 20th century, we had so much benefit from the material world, the practical world, that the spiritual side has been kind of not neglected, but just kind of downplayed. And we see that the body is real, but then we kind of question the spirit. And it's because it's not so visible. And and again, what happened in the second half of the 20th century is that the practical life really was enhanced. We discovered plastic, we discovered oil. Life became very good. That was the era in the 80s and 90s of greed, of money, and the discrepancy of social income and so forth expanded. But then beginning at that time in the 21st century, again, we're seeing a greater and deeper truth. And that is all the smog that was created because it was so convenient to drive a car and so cheap to use gasoline, that we found that smog was a problem. We found that smoking and having too much sugar was a problem. And we find that burning coal and some of the natural resources is a problem. And that, dumping the sewers and refuge into other areas which affected other cities was a problem. And so now in the 21st century, we've become a little more conscious of ecology, that stopping forest fires is not a good idea. It's a natural process. That killing wolves and mountain lions to keep, herds of sheep and cows safe was not a good idea because the deer population and other things like that increase. So now we're seeing a deeper truth in that balance is what truth is about. It's not the truth we had perhaps in the latter half of the 20th century. And so there are evidence that we're awakening to this truth of interdependence. And who's going to fix it? It's us. We're part of this. And so as Buddhists, I don't think we're going to go back to or sitting meditation pillow and meditate in hopes and prayers. But I think as Shin Buddhists, we become engaged compassion, Thich Nhat Hanh's engaged Buddhism, that we do things to affect what happens to everyone else. So again, just review this thing about the self. The three areas I would suggest is, one, admit that part of myself is evil. I have a shadow, and that opens me up that I could admit that there's room for improvement. And then a second way would be to expand myself, that I see my individual self identified with a larger group. And then three, that perhaps I'm putting too much emphasis on the body, and I need to put more emphasis on my spiritual side. And that's the difficult part, because we're not quite sure what that spiritual side might be about. And that's what we'll talk about shortly. And so, again, voicing the Buddha's name is recognizing that so many others have presented benefits for me. And whatever meager attempts I have to improve myself is overshadowed by all the things that have been provided to me. So the next benefit is this. Okay, in that the next benefit is that I have a chance to give service and serve others and to support others. And this is the Bodhisattva ideal. We are not the temple of Amida Buddha. We are the temple of the primal vow. And that vow is from a Bodhisattva. And a Bodhisattva is one who says all other beings, will be included and go before I do. And the first paramita of a Bodhisattva is dana, giving, selfless giving. And so if we look at our temples, sometimes we hear, oh, all the temple wants is more donation. They just want more money. But if you look at the temples, it's about serving others. There are so many things that the temples do. They have youth groups, whether it's scouting or sports. They support elders. Of course, they're fundraising so that these things can happen. But it is about supporting others. And it's really this putting the ideal of the Bodhisattva in action, in that we have all the pleasures of helping others, because we recognize that we're here because of the efforts of others. And so it is, incumbent of us to help others. And it's a good feeling. Sometimes we think, gee, I don't want to go out on a Saturday and, help clean up this or that. I'd rather be watching a football game. And yet when we do go out and join others and putting together programs or helping out with some project or another, we find that it really is helpful and it feels good. And that's part of who we are, that this benefit of serving others is an integral part of the temple. So look at how your temple works. All these activities we have, even the social ones, the ukulele club, we might have Japanese sports, but we have, always helping elders, many, many things where our service is about helping others. And so this temple, this dojo of learning about the Shin Dharma shows itself in things that we do. And we contribute to other organizations as a group. You can help and do something as an individual, but as a group, we can make a greater impact. And so that's the fourth benefit, that we support others. And as Bishop Arada says, we change from saying I have to do it to I get to do it. And you find that there's great, it feels good to do that. And so just to show you, Let's see. Okay, this is Alameda Buddhist Temple at their Obon. And you see these wheelchairs that are decorated. That's to help these elders who can join in the Obon dancing, but find trouble standing up and walking. But they decorated these 4 wheelchairs and invited some of the older folks so that they can join in Obon dancing. But again, this is just one thing that temples do. And, every temple does something like this. And so this is why we do it. It's part of who we are as Shin Buddhists. And it really is not to gain merit for ourselves, but it's to pass on the merit. We recognize that we received this from others, and so we pass it on to others. And so now we get to the 5th the 5th one. Whoop. Well, I guess I don't want to do that yet. Okay, I don't know. I was supposed to have another slide in there, but I guess didn't work. The 5th benefit is really to realize our spiritual nature, and that for some reason I should have that, but well, we'll see if I do have it. Well, it's in here somewhere, but I'll reach it. It's to realize, again, that half of us are mass or body, half of us is spirit. And that spiritual part goes on. We have impermanence, which means the body will go. And I'm at an age where I realize this is true. If I quit breaking all my bones, I'm being made up of steel parts now. I've got rods in my elbow and my leg and so forth. But this whole thing about this interdependence, the spirit part, it goes on. And sometimes people say, well, why do we have so many memorial services? Is it about death? No, memorial services are about life. It's about interdependence. It's the spiritual part. I think there are other religions, and you hear this a lot now. When someone passes, they just want to have a celebration of life, kind of ignore death. As I say, death in some religions is bad. For Buddhists, death is part of life. It happens. And that emphasizes our impermanence. But the other part of it is interdependence. Life goes on, and it goes on because we are connected. And these memorial services, whether monthly shotsuki, where we recognize the month that a loved one has passed, obon, every year. It could be the 7th year, 13th year. These times where we, again, reflect back, 25th year of a passing of a loved one, 33 years. We had one in our family of 50 years, just a few years ago. And so going to the cemetery, cleaning up, the cemetery, or going to the Nopotsudo, these are not about death. This is a connection with life. And hopefully, as we pass on, our children will continue this. Or will they just think, oh, like every other animal, I had life, I'm going to die, goodbye, it ends with the body. In Shin Buddhism, we have this interdependence, which means our spirit continues. We have continued for ages. It's taken 1 million ancestors in the last, 25 generations to produce me. And so I, with Aeda's poem, I take this life baton and pass it on. It's really an ongoing thing. And we emphasize this again with our memorial services, that people physically may be gone, but they still live in our hearts, and they're still there. And in our homobutsudan, whether it's photos or whatever, we stay connected. And it is this nembutsu, namo amida butsu, that connects. And again, this is that spiritual side that we may be ignoring because it's not so visible. And yet, as I have said, if the science says that mass and energy are two forms of the same thing, the body and spirituality are two forms of the same thing. The body may go in time, but the spirituality remains and it goes on. Now, there's a song called A Thousand Winds, Sen no Kaze, and it's become very popular in Japan. Reverend Aoyama in San Diego would play this harmonica and say the words. And it's that, you know, our image of what the spirit is may not be quite accurate. You know, we may think of something floating in the air, but I think it's more like that song where it says, you know, I'm not in my grave, I'm just energy, I'm just life, I'm the breeze, I'm, you know, the sunlight. There is life, you know, we see birds, we see plants, trees. And so there is this energy of life. And I think that is our Shin way of seeing this interdependence, that this Namo Amida Butsu just alerts us that part of us is spirituality and that we really honor that. Now, it's true that, yeah, most people are, again, less involved with religion. Again, it's, again, the latter half of the 20th century, we were so successful in being practical that many people assume that we know what gods are about. You know, that's just the ancient mythological way of explaining things. And yet, if we have a deeper look, we realize that we're all about spirit. It's all about energy. And that it's our ignorance that keeps us from realizing that it's not just the physical things that we can feel, but it's that invisible spiritual essence that pervades everything, that gives life to the body. So again, you know, a science and so forth makes death kind of secondhand. If we reach the hospital, we can be kept alive. But it's really not, that's really not what it's about. Death is part of us because, you know, until COVID, death was not really a concern for most of us. And then with COVID, we realized that any one of us could die because of this disease. But death has always been a part of us. And so we need to wake up, and that our body, which we can see and feel, is there, but it's the spiritual. So ending here, what is our life about? There we go. Now, yeah, what's our life about? Now, this guy on the left, we're going to be like him. Okay. Is this our answer? Yeah, if we only had enough money, if we only won the lotto, things would be fine. Except I'm going to have to live to 150 years old to enjoy it. Or would it be this, that life is about connection, relationships? You know, being at the temple is about relationships, it's about spirituality. And maybe not in the spirituality of woo-woo or being holy, but just in life itself. For the ordinary person, Nembutsu says, life itself is spiritual. All the mundane, ordinary things, when we look at it, is spiritual. And so this Nembutsu, the rituals, the Dharma talks, all these things we learn at temple, it's not about mythology. That was just a way of you know, talking about truth in the days before we really could understand things. Now, with our sophistication of technology, we can break down DNA, all these things. We may be shortchanging ourselves and thinking we know about reality, when in fact, this what the Buddha is saying, which outlives science, that there's mass and energy, there's body and spirituality, that's true. And so I want to leave you with this thought that, you know, the body is impermanent, and yet interdependent spirit is true, and it goes. And so the thread of impermanence is balanced with the assurance of interdependence. So to summarize, by focusing on benefits, let's consider, what benefits we have, and we might realize there's a different relationship with the temple and Shin Buddhism. And I think it's easier for members to relate to newcomers, what benefits they experience, rather than explaining some form of doctrine, because that's what people are wanting to hear. Why do you come to this temple? And it's because it has these benefits of having truth at a very deep level, but given to us on a practical everyday side. And then by learning these 5 areas of appreciating everyday things, having a temple, knowing more about the self, that's part of us, has a shadow part, but also can expand. That part of what we do to realize this is to share and help others. And then of course, all these things about what does the spirituality mean? And that's what we'll have to work on. What does being spiritual mean? And so is the temple really in accord with all these? Again, the last part you can read on your handout there. Gratitude, the temple dojo place, knowing your true self, which is not just the body, but, expanded service, all these things. And so, yeah, the spiritual nature of the ego can change our relationship right now. And what that means is, well, this is what the last slide was looking like. This is our reality. Okay, this is our true reality. We have this practical life, but explain this to me. How about that mortgage? How about that fight you had with yourself? This is our true reality. Nembutsu Namo Amida Butsu says, wake up. So if this is our true reality, how does that affect our relationship with others right now? So let me just end with another story, and I'll have Bishop Harada come. But let me give you this story, which I can't find. Okay, when we think about, oh, technology, wonderful. Hello. Okay, we think about the pure realm, and we might think like that one showed, if I have enough money, I can buy everything, I might just lay on the beach, everything would be taken care of for me. And I can just enjoy myself. I've had a nice lunch or drink, and I'll just lay on the beach and just enjoy the sun and, realize that everything's taken care of for me. And this is where I might say, Namo Amida Butsu, life is so great. Well, that might be an experience of, the pure realm. And just to let you know, I had that experience, but it's a little different because these things to be relative. Many of you know that I broke my hip about a month ago, and I've been recuperating. And I was in a hospital bed for a couple of weeks. That's longer than usual because I had a bowel obstruction, and that meant they wouldn't let me out. So I'm lying there, unable to move very much. They put an NG tube down my nose to pump out stuff in my stomach. I had 2 IVs, one for food, one for medication, I guess. All these things hooked up with, tubes, bladder tube, blood pressure, all these things. I can barely move, and yet I'm in this hospital bed. Everything's been taken care of for me by others, modern technology, nurses, doctors. And so I'm lying there. And one of the things is that my throat is very dry. And although I don't have to do anything, I would really, want to something in my throat. So someone is able to give me ice chips. And so as I'm chewing these ice chips, it's so exquisite, just lying there, with all these tubes and things, everything's taken care of. And then I have ice chips. And to me, that was the pureral. And just having those ice chips kind of satisfy my dry throat had me think, this is wonderful. And I started to tear and just say the Nembutsu, Namanda. And so this could be an experience of the pureral. And just to let you know, it can go deeper than that. Because the next day, not only did I experience pureral, I experienced nirvana. Because the next day, I was able to have a flavored grape popsicle. And when you're in that position, that grape popsicle is really nirvana. So with that, I'll close and we'll continue with some questions, I guess. So Sensei.
Oh, thank you very much, Reverend Kenji, for your wonderful presentation. Oh, I wholeheartedly, like I said, wholeheartedly agree with your perspective and way of interpreting Shin Buddhism in a contemporary light. One comment I'd like to make is that, over the years, I've heard many discussions about how we should look at early Buddhist teachings like Four Noble Truths and Eightfold Path, and I've heard some say, well, that's Theravada Buddhism. That's not Jodo Shinshu. We need to teach Jodo Shinshu. But I love how you incorporated a unique Shin Buddhist way of looking at the Eightfold Path and in this reverse order. I think it's a tremendous contribution to Shin Buddhist thought of looking at it from a reverse order.